The first time anyone saw the double barn set up, they laughed, not behind closed doors, not in the polite half-smile way people do when they don't know what to say. They laughed out loud, right in front of her. Henry Madsen chuckled so hard he had to brace himself on his horse's saddle. His brother Lloyd squinted at the structure and said, "Looks like two barns got drunk and fell into each other." Even the preacher's wife let slip a giggle when she passed it on her way to town, wrapped in her good Sunday shawl. No one had ever built something like that in the valley. No one had tried, but the widow didn't flinch. She stood in the frost-bit morning haze, gloved hands gripping a rusted hay-fork, not saying a word as the men rode by. The sleeves of her old coat were patched with mismatched fabric. Her collar was frayed. Her boots had been re-soled twice, leather split in the toe, but her spine didn't bend, her gaze didn't drop, not even when the younger Madsen boy turned and yelled, "You building a house or trying to marry your cows?" They laughed again, then rode on. The truth is, no one remembered her real name anymore. Not exactly. Most folks called her Widow Jansen, though she'd only been married to Arlen Jansen for 3 years before the accident. He'd gone under the horse pulling a frozen plow. Ice and hooves did what no war ever could. She didn't cry much in public after that. Sold the ox, dug the grave herself, then started hammering planks into the dirt beside the stable, alone. The double barn wasn't some grand design. It wasn't a clever invention drawn out on blue paper with rulers and plans. It was necessity, stacked, nailed, and dragged into place with bruised hands. She'd started with the existing barn, the old one Arlen built. It leaned slightly northeast from years of wind, and the roof sagged like a tired back. But the bones were strong, too good to tear down, so she built another beside it, not quite identical, just close. The new one was higher by a foot, doors aligned, sloped roofs aimed toward each other like cupped hands. Between them she raised a central frame, a sort of spine, then connected the two barns with timbered ribs and weather-wrapped walls. What resulted wasn't quite a barn, wasn't quite a house. It was in between, a hollowed center, protected by two bodies of wood on either side, reinforced by hay bales, mud, and stones packed into the wind gaps like stuffing. She lived in the center. Her animals lived in the barns. To her, it made sense. The heat from the animals seeped through the walls. The wind that cracked against the sides got trapped in the layers before it could reach the center. Firewood lasted longer. Water buckets didn't freeze solid before sunrise. She didn't have to run through snowdrifts at night to check on a coughing cow or a lamb going into labor. She was already there, but none of that mattered to the people who watched her hammerboards through October, who heard her dragging stones in November, who saw her children, thin, silent, dutiful, help her tamp mud into crevices as snow started to fall. To them it was ridiculous. "You seen what she's building?" said Harlan Tate at the trading post. "Looks like a barn had babies. You know she's sleeping between the animals? She's gone off, I tell you. Ain't right. Poor kids. Born into madness." They watched, they whispered, but they didn't help. It wasn't until the first cold snap that anyone paused. Even then, it wasn't concern, it was curiosity. Wind had cracked through a few homesteads in early December. The river had frozen so quick it trapped fish mid-motion, mouths open in the ice. 3 roofs caved in under sleet and wet snow, and yet her odd, ugly structure stood. Steam curled from the middle chimney. There were no footprints leaving it after dark, no lantern bobbing down the path toward the stable. Because she didn't need to go anywhere. The heat from the animals bled inward. The fire she built didn't have to fight the cold from all sides. At night she wrapped the children in wool and tucked them against the inner wall, where it was always 20 degrees warmer than outside. The cows stirred gently just a few feet away, their warmth working like a heartbeat behind the boards. She'd rub the ice from the inside of the window panes and smile when the dogs lay down without shivering. Still, no one asked her why she did it. No one offered to copy her. The laughter faded, but the smirks stayed. Until the blizzard came. It wasn't announced like the others. No birds flew strange. No clouds stacked black on the ridge. It came with stillness. No wind, no sound, not even a warning in the horse's ears. Just a gray noon sky. And then, all at once, a wall of snow that fell sideways, like it had been thrown, like it had teeth. It hit the southern edge of the valley first, took out the Miller family's barn roof in the first hour. The cattle panicked. They found the cowhand 10 feet from the gate, frozen half to his knees. The horses kicked holes through the stable door before the hinges broke off entirely. The storm moved north like a crawling animal, slow and deliberate. It didn't rush. It consumed. Windows shattered not from the snow, but from pressure, the kind that warped wood and split beams. The Abernathy barn collapsed before nightfall. The town church shivered on its foundation, and lost a third of its roof by midnight. And by then, no one was laughing, not when the screams started carrying on the wind, not when folks realized they couldn't get their animals out in time, not when doors froze shut from the inside, not when the stable beams, old and untreated, swelled from moisture and snapped like necks. It was the Madsons who came knocking first. Henry's gloves were soaked, his face bloodied from a snapped tree branch. He was dragging his daughter behind him, wrapped in a coat that barely covered her. "Please," he said, "we didn't think it had come this fast. We can't keep the fires going. We're out of hay. The cows are panicking." She opened the door without speaking, just nodded them in. He entered and froze, not from cold, but from the heat. It was warm inside, not summer warm, but close, the kind of warmth that rose up the boots and sat on the shoulders. The animals lowed softly from the sides of the walls. Hay bales insulated the outer edges. No wind got in. The air held. His daughter cried for the first time in hours. Lloyd came the next morning, then the Tates, then 3 families from the Ridge Trail, dragging their horses behind them, eyes hollow. One woman had frostbite on 3 fingers. A young boy's ear was black. By the end of the second day, 12 people were packed into that double barn, and not one asked where the beds were. They just laid down in the straw and breathed, as if lungs were finally allowed to expand. They didn't ask her how she'd known. She didn't tell them. But when night came, and the wind howled again, and the walls held, when the animals shifted but didn't scream, when the candles stayed lit and the roof didn't drip, when the temperature in the center stayed the same as the night before, no one laughed anymore. By the 3rd day, Widow Jansen's double barn had become a sanctuary, though no one called it that out loud. Folks didn't have the breath for fancy words. They came in coughing, chattering, red-eyed, and blue-lipped, dragging what livestock they could manage, wrapped in whatever layers hadn't frozen stiff. Some arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs, others still leading horses or hauling broken sleds with salvaged sacks of oats and shivering children riding atop. The widow didn't say much. She didn't turn anyone away. She simply opened the side door and pointed toward the hollow where firelight never faltered. Most didn't recognize what they were stepping into until they'd been inside for several minutes, until the smell of animals turned oddly comforting, until the warmth sank deep into their spines and made their limbs tremble with the shock of it. Some cried. A few fell straight to the floor. She fed them without asking names. Salt pork boiled with dried cabbage, warm milk fresh from the cow's flank, hard bread softened with water and fat scraped from the pan. It wasn't generous. It was necessary. The children, hers and theirs, ate first. She enforced that rule with the swing of her gaze alone. No one challenged it, not even grown men who hadn't tasted meat in days. The stable walls, packed with hay bales and lined with wet coats drying slowly on lines overhead, smelled of smoke, sweat, and livestock. But in the blizzard, it might as well have been a palace. Meanwhile, outside, the rest of the valley buckled. On the ridge, the Langley barns split at the roof seam and collapsed entirely. 17 animals inside. Only 4 survived, and those with frost-bitten legs. The Langleys buried the rest beneath 5 feet of snow, frozen solid before noon. Their remaining firewood, stored under a tarp beside the shed, had gone brittle with ice and took hours to thaw before it could burn. At the trading post, the chimney cracked. Wind forced its way into the seams and froze the iron stove from the inside. The clerk abandoned the post and was later found curled against a windbreak beneath a fallen pine, one hand still gripping the shop key. At this point, nobody asked why the widow had built the double barn. They asked how. They crowded the corners of the room and studied the seams. Where one barn met the other, she had packed earth and hay into a wall nearly 2 feet thick. Between the layers, she'd stuffed rags, leather scraps, wool soaked in lard, anything that could block the draft. Each gap was plugged, each doorway fitted with 2 doors, one outer, one inner, separated by a mud-chinked vestibule, a coat room of sorts that stole the wind from travelers before it could enter the living space. Even the animals weren't housed together. On one side, the cows and pigs, warmer, heavier. On the other, goats, chickens, and the lone surviving horse she'd taken in last spring from a traveler who never returned. The animal's body heat pulsed inward from both sides like lungs breathing into the core. She'd lined the floor of the center room with stones, flat and heavy, then laid straw, rugs, and boards atop it. The rocks held heat from the stove longer than dirt ever could. Fires didn't have to be big, just steady. One fire in the center of that space could keep the whole structure warm into the small hours of the night. By the 5th night of the blizzard, 22 people were sleeping inside, and not one of them mocked her anymore. They took turns tending the fire, tending the animals, melting snow for water. Nobody waited for orders, not after seeing how she worked, quietly, efficiently, without complaint. They followed her example. A man named Dirk Fallon, whose own barn had been crushed under a maple tree 3 nights before, stayed near the pigs and helped a sow deliver 3 still warm piglets in a nest of steaming straw. He cried when the runt opened its mouth and squealed. A young girl named Miriam, who had barely spoken since arriving with her frostbitten mother, started helping Widow Jansen's boy carry water in from the snowdrifts, backpacks filled with warmed stones to melt the ice inside the buckets faster. Even the Madsons, Henry and Lloyd, formerly full of chuckles and grins, quieted. They sat by the door in shifts, boots by the threshold, watching the snow pile up against the outer barn doors. One night, Lloyd whispered, "You think this thing's gonna hold forever?" Henry didn't answer. By then, the snow had risen high enough to bury fence posts. Roofs vanished beneath wind-packed drifts. No one had seen the sun in 6 days. Inside the widow's walls it was dim but dry, warm enough for bare hands to work, warm enough for milk to stay liquid in the pail, warm enough to sleep without fear of never waking. And then came the night the wind changed. They heard it before they felt it. The sound stopped. No one noticed at first. They were used to the groan, the moan of wind pressing against boards like some massive body wanting in. But now, there was nothing, a quiet so thick it felt wrong. The widow stood at the stove, stirring a pot of barley. She looked up once, then turned the flame down low. "It's not over," she said. "It's shifting." Someone asked what that meant. She didn't answer. They found out the next morning. The silence broke at dawn with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. Then another, and another, like the world was splitting. What it was trees, snapping from weight and pressure. Dozens of them. The snow, no longer carried sideways by the wind, was falling straight down, so heavy and so fast, it was burying entire cabins in a single morning. The drifts rose to 6, then 8, then 10 feet. Then came the thaw freeze, brief sun behind the clouds that softened the top layers just enough for the weight to compress. Then the cold returned with such speed it turned the soft snow to slabs of ice. Cabins disappeared completely. Stables with slanted roofs were crushed. People tried digging. Some were too late. They found one man dead inside a root cellar, door iced shut from the outside. Another under a collapsed shed with his ox dead beside him. And yet in the middle of the carnage the double barn stood. Even buried halfway in snow, it held. The slanted twin roofs distributed the weight. The central spine, built like a beam down a ship, absorbed the pressure. The mud-chinked vestibules held the seals tight, and inside, Widow Jansen kept feeding the stove, feeding the people, feeding the animals. They lived in 3-hour cycles: firewood, water, feeding, sleep, and back again. No clocks, just rhythm, just survival. And then came the sled. They heard it first, a distant creak, a faint clink of metal. At first they thought it was hallucination. No one could have traveled in that snow. But then came the knock, not on the outer barn door, but on the roof. The Madsons scrambled up the ladder. They pried loose the hatch near the hayloft and stared out into blinding white, and there she was, Mother Brinley, 61 years old, face red with cold, teeth clenched. Behind her, a single horse, dragging a sleigh wrapped in oilcloth. 2 small children huddled under the tarp. The horse's ribs were visible. Its eyes rolled with exhaustion. "She's got no place left," Henry whispered. "Her whole roof's gone." The widow came up behind him, wrapped in a coat stitched from 3 old blankets. She didn't hesitate. "Clear the hayloft," she said. "Let the kids sleep up here. The horse can come into the vestibule between the barns. I'll lay straw down. It'll hold till morning." And that was that. By the 8th day, there were 29 people in the barn. 2 infants, 4 old women, 3 dogs, 6 cows, 4 pigs, 5 goats, and 1 exhausted horse. And still the blizzard raged. But inside that strange, foolish-looking structure, built by a widow no one believed in, no one helped, no one respected, there was life, warmth, order, fire, milk, children's breath that didn't fog when they laughed. And outside, there was only ice and the sound of things breaking. The 9th night was the worst. The fire flickered low, despite careful feeding, not because they were out of wood, though that threat had loomed close, but because the air was turning heavy, tight, as if the storm outside had finally begun to press inward. Wind didn't howl now. It moaned, not like something passing by, but like something circling, wrapping its arms around the barn and slowly squeezing. Children stirred in their sleep. One of the Fallon twins started mumbling and kicked his legs as if running in a dream. A kettle hanging over the fire hissed, steam curling upward before slowing, confused by the air's weight. The widow didn't sleep that night. She moved between the barns in thick socks and a shawl wrapped 3 times around her shoulders. She checked the seams, running a palm along mud and cloth and packed straw. She listened, tapped the wood, pressed her ear against the beams. She sniffed the air like an animal, tasted the smoke on her tongue. And every time she passed a sleeping child or huddled old mother. She reached out and adjusted a blanket, nudged a log closer to the hearth, or made note of which corner would need warming bricks next. Around midnight, she climbed up the loft ladder and knelt beside the hatch. Ice crusted the rim. She scratched it away with a worn knife, pried the boards apart and stuck her hand into the open gap. Nothing, no wind, just wait. The air outside was so still it felt unnatural. That's when she knew it wasn't done. It was gathering. By dawn, the snow had reached the top of the doorframe. The double barn was almost entirely buried. The only remaining escape point was the loft hatch, and even that was a tunnel now, carved through 5 feet of snow, held open by boards, lashed with rope and braced by sticks. And then came the screaming. It started from the west. A voice carried through the snow, not with clarity but urgency, muffled but sharp, desperate. It made the dogs whimper. The men stirred and stumbled toward the hatch, pulling on coats, stuffing feet into boots still stiff from drying overnight. Henry Madsen climbed first, holding a lantern. He disappeared into the tunnel, and for a moment all they could hear was the crunch of his knees pushing through snow. Then silence. Then he shouted, "3 people! 2 kids! Digging!" Others grabbed shovels. Some didn't bother with tools and clawed barehanded. It took 20 minutes to break through to the west face of the barn. 20 minutes through snow that packed like sand, wet, heavy, dragging at every limb. The air stung their lungs even inside the tunnel. When they found the figures, they were nearly buried. 1 woman, 2 boys. The woman's coat had frozen so stiff it cracked when she turned. 1 boy had shoes made of wrapped cloth. The other wore mittens that had been burnt black at the edges, likely dried too close to a fire. They had walked 4 miles from Miller's Hollow. They'd buried their own stable, lost all livestock. Their cabin had caved 2 nights prior, and they'd been holed up in the root cellar ever since, eating onions and sucking melted snow from a cooking pan. "How'd you know to come here?" one man asked as they helped carry the children in. The woman looked up with hollow eyes and chapped lips. "Everyone else is dead." They wrapped the children in sheepskins and laid them beside the fire. The dogs curled up beside them without command. The mother collapsed onto a hay bale and slept for 16 hours. After that, something changed. People stopped wondering if they were going to make it through. They knew they had to, because now they weren't just holding on for themselves. They were the last light on the ridge, the last warm place in the valley. If they failed, there wouldn't be anyone left to come looking. No hands to dig out the buried, no eyes to see spring, so they organized. The widow didn't bark orders. She didn't have to. She moved through the barn and people followed. She'd lift an eyebrow at a sagging beam, and 2 men would brace it within the hour. She'd pause at the water barrels, and 4 women would begin boiling snow. She'd glance at the mud chinking, and the children would fetch straw to plug fresh gaps. One man suggested cutting into the last half stack of firewood. She looked at him quiet and asked, "And what will you do the next night?" He blushed and backed down. Instead, they burned everything else: an old table, 2 broken chairs, crates, fence posts that had been stored in the rear. One man even offered his wagon, disassembled and fed into the fire like kindling. "Never liked that thing anyhow," he said. No one laughed. Not anymore. And through it all, the widow moved like a shadow, present, unshakable, tireless, until she collapsed. It was the 12th day of the storm. She'd gone quiet mid-task, squatting beside the goat pen, checking for signs of birth. She stood, wobbled, then dropped. People rushed to her. She waved them off. "Stove needs stoking," she muttered. "Barley's boiling." But her face was pale, her lips were dry. "She hasn't eaten," one girl said. "Not in 2 days." That's when they realized. She'd been giving her shares away. Every meal, every ration, cutting her portion in half, passing off her bread, emptying her cup. When they tried to argue, she shook her head. "You keep the children alive, the mothers. That's all that matters." "No," someone said. "You matter." And so for the first time, they pushed her aside, gently, respectfully, but firmly. They laid her down near the center stove, fed her broth by the spoon, and refused to let her rise for 3 days. Others took over her tasks, not because they wanted to, but because they owed her, because they understood. She had built a home in a graveyard of stables. She had made heat out of straw, stone, and belief. She had saved the valley, not with a miracle, not with a man's hand, not with a hero's pride, but with sense and grit and a kind of stubborn quiet that didn't ask permission to survive. And then came the 13th night. The fire burned low. The air shifted again, but not in threat. It was light. The pressure lifted. The walls sighed instead of groaned. Somewhere deep outside the snowpack, something cracked. Not sharply, but like a breaking seal. The blizzard was ending. They could feel it. The air had changed, no longer thick with ice, no longer humming with danger. When dawn broke, the hatch let in a shaft of white gold. Not blinding, not cruel, just sunlight. Henry Madsen climbed out first. He dug to the top of the drift, stood on the peak of what had once been a sloping hill, and looked around. Everything else was gone. Cabins flattened, fences vanished, barns erased. Only the widow's structure remained, half buried, covered in ice and straw, like a shipwrecked ark. He stood there, breathing, then whispered back down the hatch. She did it. No one spoke. They all knew what he meant. The storm hadn't spared them. She had. They emerged slowly, like moles blinking in a world too bright. One by one, bundled in blankets and patched wool, they climbed through the loft hatch and stood atop a frozen ridge of what had once been Widow Jansen's hayloft. From that vantage point, all illusions fell away. The valley was gone. Not gone in the way of memory or nostalgia. Gone, as in flattened, scoured, buried. Where fences once zigzagged like thread through pasture land, now only smooth white stretched, undisturbed to the horizon. The tree line looked sheared in half, branches broken, trunks cracked like matchsticks. Homes were simply missing, chimneys poked up like gravestones in some places. In others, not even that. The trading post, leveled, the Langley house, now a jagged crater of half-collapsed timbers. The church, a drift-covered dome, barely taller than a man's shoulders. Entire lives erased in the wake of the storm, but not hers. Widow Jansen's double barn still stood, though you had to squint to see it was anything other than a mound of ice and hay. The eastern face, buried clean to the eaves, was buttressed by frozen snow like a fortress wall. The two slanted roofs had held the weight, shedding enough to keep their peaks visible. The center spine, reinforced with thatch and beams no one had thought to brace, remained perfectly upright. And inside, alive. They started digging. It wasn't a decision, really. Just instinct. They shoveled the hatch wider, cleared a trench to the ground, uncovered the doorways, the feed bins, the outer firewood stores now iced shut like relics. Henry and Lloyd Madsen, red-eyed but stone-faced, broke apart the drift covering the back barn wall and knocked snow from the overhang. Others followed. The widow watched from the hatch for a long time before coming down. Her coat dragged behind her like a cloak, stiff with frost. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She simply reached the bottom of the trench and stared westward. They asked what she was looking at. She said, everything. The days that followed were cold but calm. There was no more snow, no more screaming wind, just brittle sunlight that bounced off every surface until the world looked like a mirror. In that light, they buried the dead. They didn't find everyone. Some were likely gone forever, trapped under collapsed roofs or lost in the woods, too far from shelter. But they found enough. Neighbors frozen in their wagons, children huddled in sheds, couples clutching one another beneath caved-in roofs. They used sleds to carry the bodies to a flat rise behind the widow's barn, where the wind didn't reach. The ground was too frozen for digging, and so they piled snow, wrapped the dead, and said prayers into the open air. No one asked who should speak. One of the Fallon girls began humming a hymn, and the rest followed. It was enough. Then came the counting. They took stock. Animals, food, wood, hands. The tally was grim. Of the 49 people known to have lived in the valley before the storm, 26 had survived, and 29 now lived in or around the widow's barn, including new arrivals from the next ridge over who came stumbling in days after the snow had stopped, led by word of mouth and fading hope. Firewood was almost gone. Food would run out within the week, and yet no one panicked, because the widow had survived on less. And they'd seen what she built, that strange, lopsided shelter mocked by all, now the only standing structure for miles. So they copied her. They cut and lashed together what remained of fence posts, logs, even broken wagons to form new lean-tos around the barn. The double barn became the heart of a camp, a survivor's outpost. They built windbreaks, dug snow caves, hollowed out packed drifts for food storage. They carved channels through the snow, stacking what they shoveled into banks as high as men's heads to block the wind from the east. The widow moved among them, quieter now. She was tired in a way that bone couldn't explain, but her eyes still scanned the seams, still spotted the cracks before they widened. She showed them how to burn less fuel by trapping heat in fire bricks, how to use stones warmed in the fire to heat sleeping pallets, how to dress wounds with animal fat and pine pitch. She taught survival, not as theory, but as muscle memory. When word finally came, a rider from the state, weeks after the storm, cutting through thawing trails on a half-starved gelding, it was with shock that he found anyone left. He'd been sent with 3 others to check the valley, expected to find bodies. What he found was a wall of snow with a single dark line of smoke rising from the center. They fed the horse first, then the rider. He listened to what happened and didn't believe it until he walked inside the double barn, saw the construction, saw the rows of fire-blackened stones lining the floor, saw the babies alive and kicking in the hayloft, saw the widow sitting with a knife in one hand, carving a spoon from a piece of pine wood, as if she hadn't just saved half the valley. He said, "You were lucky." She looked up. "No," she said. "Prepared." The news spread fast. Within a month, wagons arrived from the nearest township. The rail line reopened south of the ridge. Supplies came first: flour, oats, medicine, then people, relatives, strangers, builders, even a newspaper man from Denver who walked around scribbling in a little pad, muttering double barn," like it was a headline. The widow didn't speak to him. She didn't want her name in a story. She didn't want her picture in a paper. She didn't even want to be thanked. What she did want was hay, planks, nails, rope, stone, because she wasn't done. Spring came like a stranger knocking after a long war, slowly, awkwardly, but it came. The drifts melted, the roads returned, grass poked through near the creek, and still her structure stood. That summer, when they held a gathering to honor the dead and the living, the preacher asked her to say a word. Just one, for the children, for the survivors, for what she'd done. She walked up front, straightened her shawl, and looked out over the rows of faces, sunburnt, wind-scoured, aged by the storm. She said, "Next year, build your barns smarter," then sat down. There was silence. Then a laugh, not cruel, not mocking, a different kind. One by one, people chuckled, then clapped, and the noise rolled through the valley like thunder waking the soil. Because she was right, the blizzard had taken the stables, the storm had taken the town, but the widow's double barn had held, and from it the valley would begin again. Spring came late that year. Even when the sun shone high and the melt began, the ground resisted. Frost still lived deep beneath the surface, like a warning that it wasn't done with them yet. But above it, life stirred. By mid-April, the snow finally pulled back from the base of Widow Jansen's double barn, revealing not ruin but resilience, timbers still solid, seams still tight, straw still packed. There were water stains along the lower edge where the runoff had pooled, but nothing rotted, nothing broke. The valley, however, was a different story. The church remained roofless, its bell half buried in silt and soot. Most cabins had collapsed inward like broken boxes, and those still standing were riddled with cracks and frost heaves. The trading post had been abandoned, its front wall peeled away by wind and snow weight. Trees lay like dead men across the ridgelines, their limbs snapped or stripped bare. But there were people again. Not many, not all, but enough. Some families left, no shame in it. They'd had their fill of blizzards and narrow chances. They packed up what little they had, thanked the widow for saving their lives, and headed south with the thaw. Some went to towns with proper roads, warm hotels, rail stations. Others disappeared westward, chasing promises in gold or farmland or silence. But most stayed, and they stayed because of her. Widow Jansen hadn't just saved their lives, she had taught them. She'd built something out of ridicule that now stood as proof, undeniable, irrefutable, that there was another way. That the old methods, the common sense that failed, weren't the only answers. That survival was not just about strength, it was about structure. So they watched her. And then they built again, but this time not as before. They dug lower, they built tighter, they layered walls with hay and clay. They stole her idea of the vestibule, a chamber to break the wind. They carved central spines in their barns, anchored them deeper, added stone where there had been only planks. One man even built a triple barn, 3 wings in a horseshoe, with the living quarters in the curve of the U. He called it the Widow's Fold. She rolled her eyes when she heard it. They asked her to design their barns. She declined. "Build it yourself," she said. "That's how you learn where the weak spots are." But when children asked her questions, she always answered. She showed them where the roof caught snow, how to vent smoke without losing heat, how to use old rags and ashes to plug cracks in the wall. Her own son, a boy of 12 who had never spoken much before the storm, now stood beside her when she spoke, nodding, watching the way she traced diagrams in the dirt with a stick. One day, she took a group of them to the edge of the property and showed them a ditch half dug and abandoned. "This was where Arlen was going to put a second barn," she said, almost absently. "We argued about it. I thought it should go the other way. He said it wouldn't hold weight that way." She looked at them. "I was right." Then she turned and walked back to the barn, leaving them standing there, unsure whether they'd just witnessed a confession, a joke, or both. In May, grass returned. Wildflowers, slow at first, then in bunches. Yellow bursts across the fields like lanterns on a dark night. The animals grazed again. New calves were born. The first chicken eggs cracked open in warm nests, not frozen ones. And still the double barn stood, no longer as a curiosity, now as a monument. In June, a man came from the county seat, called himself an assessor, carried a leather-bound notebook and a silver measuring chain, said he was writing a report on structures that survived the Great Freeze, had already visited 2 towns where nothing remained. When he saw the double barn, he stopped walking. "Which engineer designed this?" Everyone pointed. She was in the garden, digging potatoes. The man blinked. Her! She looked up, wiped dirt from her hands. You the assessor? Yes, ma'am. William Krause, State of Colorado. She nodded. You want to know how it held? I do. She stood, straightened her back and gestured toward the structure. 2 thick walls with animals in each, she said. Their heat bleeds inward. Center chamber for people. Small footprint, low roof pitch, angled so the snow slides off. Packed hay and mud on every seam. Fire stove in the middle. Raised stone floor to trap heat. Dual doors for windbreak. That's it. He wrote it down. Did you have blueprints? No. Did your husband design it? She looked at him. No. He blinked again, cleared his throat. May I take some measurements? She shrugged. Go ahead. He did. For 6 hours. Measured every beam, every plank, every joint. He even asked to sleep in it overnight. I want to feel how it holds heat. She let him. The next morning, he came out rubbing his hands and muttering, ingenious, absolutely ingenious. She gave him a piece of warm bread and sent him on his way. Months passed. Then one day in early autumn, a letter arrived. It was addressed to Mrs. Jansen, Ridge Hollow, Double Barn, no postage, delivered by hand. Inside was a stamped certificate with an official seal and long paragraph explaining that her structure was now a model, recommended by the county for extreme weather conditions. It would be copied, taught, used. She didn't frame it. She used the back to sketch a new layout for a chicken coop, but the people framed it. They hung it in the town hall, once the trading post, now rebuilt with thicker walls and stone foundation. Visitors came to see it, came to see her. They called it ingenuity, called her brilliant, called her brave, but she didn't want that. She told her son one night, long after the last visitors had gone home, all I wanted was for the kids to make it. He nodded. We did. Then she paused. But don't forget what it cost. He didn't ask what she meant, because he knew the valley had nearly died, and while she'd saved many, others hadn't been so lucky. Names were missing, chairs were empty, children still asked for parents who'd never return. But amid the grief, something had changed. Respect. Not the loud kind, not the medal on the chest kind, the quiet kind, the kind that made grown men listen when she spoke, the kind that made women nod when she passed, the kind that made children ask her how she did it, not the building, but the enduring. She never answered that part. She just said, you'll find out when the next storm comes. And in the valley, now seeded with new grass, stronger beams, and deeper roots, they waited, not in fear, but in readiness. And the widow, she kept building.